You'll never be her actual father, so quit playing house. Those words hit me like a wrench to the gut, but they also clarified everything I'd been questioning for months about my role in this family I thought I'd helped build. I stood in our Phoenix kitchen at 11:47 p.m. on a Tuesday night, the granite countertops I'd installed myself reflecting the under-cabinet lighting I'd wired when we remodeled 3 years ago, having what I thought was a reasonable discussion about our 17-year-old daughter Harmony attending an overnight music festival 3 states away. I'd been raising this kid for over a decade, walked her down the aisle at her 8th grade graduation, legally adopted her when she was 9, changed her last name to mine, and established a college fund that now held $43,000 from my plumbing business profits. I'd taught her to ride a bike, helped with countless science projects, attended every parent-teacher conference, and considered myself her father in every way that mattered. But apparently, none of that counted for anything when Patricia wanted to undermine my authority as a parent in front of the kid I'd sacrificed so much for. The argument started innocently enough when Harmony announced over dinner that she and 3 friends were planning to drive to some music festival in Colorado, stay in a hotel room together, and miss 2 days of school during her junior year when grades actually mattered for college applications. I expressed reasonable concerns about teenagers I'd never met driving 8 hours to party in another state without adult supervision, staying in a hotel room that would inevitably become party central, and missing important class time when she was already struggling in AP chemistry. I wasn't being unreasonable or controlling. I was being a responsible father who understood that good decisions now would impact her future opportunities. Patricia immediately took Harmony's side, rolling her eyes and sighing dramatically like I was some overbearing tyrant instead of the guy who'd been paying for her dance lessons, SAT tutoring, car payments, insurance, cell phone bills, and everything else that came with raising a modern teenager. I tried explaining my position calmly and rationally, mentioning that this particular festival had developed a reputation for drug problems, that several underage attendees had been hospitalized for alcohol poisoning last year, and that the local police had issued warnings about increased criminal activity during the event. I suggested we could compromise by finding a similar festival closer to home or waiting until after graduation when missing school wouldn't impact her grades, but Patricia cut me off with that devastating sentence that revealed exactly how she'd always viewed our family dynamic despite a decade of marriage and shared responsibility. She told me I had no business making parental decisions because I wasn't Harmony's biological father, that my opinion didn't matter in decisions about her daughter, and that I needed to stop pretending to be something I wasn't. Harmony stood there in our dining room, surrounded by the family photos that included all 3 of us at Christmas mornings and birthday celebrations, watching this unfold without saying a single word in my defense, just nodding along with her mother's brutal assessment that I had no real authority or standing in this house I'd been paying the mortgage on for 8 years. I felt something fundamental shift inside me as I realized that despite 10 years of marriage, despite legally adopting Harmony and giving her my last name, despite providing financial stability and emotional support through middle school drama and high school challenges, I'd somehow remained nothing more than an outsider being tolerated in my own family. The next morning, I was getting ready for work when I overheard Patricia and Harmony in the living room, laughing and joking about the previous night's argument, and Patricia's voice carried clearly as she told her daughter not to worry about my concerns because I was basically just the guy who fixes their pipes when something breaks and pays the bills when they come due. Harmony giggled and agreed, saying it was ridiculous that I thought I had any real say in her life decisions when everyone knew I was just Patricia's husband, not her actual father, and that she'd never really considered me anything more than a convenient source of funding for the lifestyle she'd grown accustomed to living. Standing there in the hallway listening to them casually dismiss a decade of my life and investment in their family, I understood that everything I'd believed about our relationship had been an elaborate illusion I'd constructed to make sense of a situation where I was being systematically used and manipulated. I'd spent 10 years thinking I was building something meaningful with a woman I loved and raising a daughter who would someday appreciate the stability and opportunities I'd provided, but I was actually just funding someone else's comfortable lifestyle while being tolerated as a convenient source of income and free home repairs. Standing there listening to them joke about my role in their lives like I was some kind of live-in handyman who occasionally shared Patricia's bed, I made a decision that would change everything for all three of us in ways they couldn't possibly imagine at that moment. I met Patricia and 6-year-old Harmony 8 years ago at a community pool party hosted by my neighbor Dave, who thought I needed to get out more after spending most weekends working on home renovation projects and growing my plumbing business. I was 39 at the time, a master plumber who'd built a successful residential plumbing operation in Tucson from absolutely nothing, starting with a beat-up truck and a toolbox full of equipment I'd bought secondhand from a retiring contractor. Patricia was 28, recently divorced, and struggling to raise Harmony on her own after the kid's biological father had disappeared without a trace when she was barely 2 years old. The guy had lost his construction job during the recession, packed his belongings one night while Patricia was working a late shift at the restaurant where she waited tables, and left no forwarding address or contact information, essentially abandoning his daughter like she was some kind of inconvenience he could just walk away from. Patricia worked 2 jobs trying to make ends meet, waiting tables during the day and cleaning offices at night, while Harmony spent most of her time with various babysitters and relatives who could watch her when Patricia couldn't afford proper childcare. I remember watching this little blonde girl playing by herself at the pool party, building elaborate sand castles in the playground area while other kids splashed around with their families, and something about her quiet independence reminded me of my own childhood when my dad worked double shifts at the auto plant and my mom took extra cleaning jobs to pay the bills. I introduced myself to Patricia and learned she was renting a small apartment in a complex known for thin walls and frequent police visits, trying to save money for a security deposit on something better in a safer neighborhood where Harmony could walk to school without Patricia worrying about drug dealers and domestic violence calls. Our relationship developed gradually and naturally over the next 18 months through weekend barbecues at my house, teaching Harmony to swim in my backyard pool, and helping her with science projects that required basic understanding of water pressure and electrical circuits. I enjoyed having them around, and Harmony seemed to genuinely like spending time with me, asking endless questions about how pipes worked and why water came out hot or cold depending on which handle you turned. Patricia appeared grateful for the stability and security I offered, telling me repeatedly how nice it was to have a man in their lives who actually showed up when he said he would and followed through on his commitments instead of making empty promises and disappearing when things got complicated. I proposed on Harmony's 8th birthday, presenting Patricia with a simple but beautiful engagement ring I'd saved for months to buy, and asking Harmony if she'd like me to be her dad officially, not just the guy who taught her to swim and helped with homework. She hugged me tight and said yes with tears in her eyes, and I felt like I'd finally found the family I'd always wanted but never thought I'd have. We married 6 months later in a small ceremony at Dave's house with just our closest friends and Patricia's sister as witnesses, and I legally adopted Harmony when she turned 9, going through all the paperwork and court proceedings to change her last name to mine and establish myself as her legal father in every way that mattered. I opened a college savings account the day the adoption was finalized, depositing $2,000 from my business profits and setting up automatic monthly contributions of $500, because I wanted her to have opportunities I'd never had and options beyond working with her hands like I'd been forced to do when college wasn't financially possible for my family. Patricia seemed happy during those early years, telling her friends how lucky she was to have found a man who treated her daughter like his own and provided the kind of stability she'd never experienced in her previous relationships, and I believed we were building something solid and permanent together. I converted my spare bedroom into Harmony's room, painting it purple because that was her favorite color and installing custom shelving for her growing collection of books and art supplies, and watching her face light up when she saw it for the first time made every hour of work and every dollar spent feel completely worthwhile. Those first few years felt like everything I'd imagined family life should be, with weekend trips to the zoo and science museums, birthday parties with her school friends, and quiet evenings helping with homework while Patricia made dinner and we talked about our days like a real family. I'd purchased the house we lived in 5 years before I ever met Patricia, buying a 1980s ranch-style property in a desirable Tucson school district that had been sitting on the market as a foreclosure after the previous owners defaulted on their mortgage during the housing crash. The place was a disaster when I first walked through it with my realtor, with outdated plumbing that leaked constantly, electrical work that violated half the building codes in Arizona, and a kitchen that looked like it hadn't been updated since Reagan was president. Most potential buyers took one look at the scope of work required and walked away immediately, but I saw opportunity where others saw problems, knowing I had the skills and knowledge to transform this 3-bedroom, 2-bathroom house into something special through my plumbing expertise and weekend renovation projects. I spent the next 2 years completely gutting and rebuilding the interior, replacing every pipe from the main water line to the individual fixtures, rewiring the entire electrical system to modern standards, and installing new flooring throughout the house using materials I got at wholesale prices through my contractor connections. The kitchen renovation alone took 6 months of evenings and weekends, but when I finished installing granite countertops, stainless steel appliances, and custom cabinetry I'd built myself, the transformation was remarkable enough that neighbors started asking for my business card. My business attorney, Michael Rodriguez, had watched too many contractors lose everything in messy divorces over the years, and he insisted on drafting a comprehensive prenuptial agreement before Patricia and I got married, specifically designed to protect the business assets and real estate investments I'd spent 12 years building from nothing. Michael explained that Arizona was a community property state, meaning anything acquired during marriage would be split equally in a divorce, but property and assets owned before marriage could be protected with proper legal documentation and clear financial boundaries. The prenup clearly outlined that my house, my plumbing business, my truck and equipment, and my pre-marriage savings accounts would remain my separate property regardless of what happened to our relationship, while anything we acquired together as a married couple would be divided equally if we ever split up. Patricia initially resisted signing the agreement, calling it insulting and unromantic, saying it felt like I was planning for our marriage to fail before it even started, and asking why I didn't trust her enough to merge our lives completely without legal protection. I spent hours explaining that the prenup wasn't about trust or planning for failure, but about protecting what I'd worked so hard to build during 12 years of 60-hour work weeks, emergency calls at 3 a.m, and reinvesting every profit back into growing my business instead of spending money on vacations and luxuries like most people my age. I told her about contractors I'd known who lost their trucks, their tools, their customer lists, and their livelihoods because they hadn't protected their business assets before getting married, and how Michael had seen men lose everything they'd worked for because they assumed love would be enough to prevent financial devastation during divorce proceedings. Patricia eventually agreed to sign after I assured her the agreement only protected what I'd built before we met, and that everything we created together as husband and wife would belong to both of us equally, including any improvements to the house, any expansion of the business, and any savings we accumulated during our marriage. The document we both signed was thorough and specific, outlining exactly which bank accounts, investment portfolios, business contracts, and pieces of real estate belonged to me individually, and establishing that Patricia would have no claim to my pre-marriage assets while ensuring she'd receive half of anything we built together during our relationship. Looking back now, I realize that Michael's insistence on legal protection probably saved me from complete financial ruin, because Patricia's reaction to the prenup should have warned me about her true priorities and expectations for our marriage. The way she focused on what she wouldn't be able to claim rather than what we'd build together revealed a mindset I was too optimistic to recognize at the time, but Michael's experience with divorce had taught him to spot the warning signs I was too in love to notice. The problems in our household started becoming obvious about 18 months ago, when Patricia began systematically undermining every parental decision I tried to make regarding Harmony's education, social activities, and basic responsibilities around the house. I'd established reasonable rules about completing homework before using electronic devices or hanging out with friends, but Patricia would secretly give Harmony permission to break these guidelines whenever I wasn't home, creating confusion and resentment that made it impossible for me to maintain any consistent expectations or boundaries. When I'd come home from work to find Harmony playing video games while her algebra homework sat unfinished on the kitchen table, she'd tell me that her mother had said it was okay to take a break first, and Patricia would back up this story with a shrug and an explanation that I was being too rigid about minor things that didn't really matter in the long run. I tried explaining that academic success required discipline and time management skills that would serve Harmony well in college and beyond, but Patricia consistently treated my concerns like unreasonable demands from someone who didn't understand how modern teenagers needed to balance schoolwork with social development and personal interests. The undermining reached a critical point when Patricia purchased Harmony an expensive gaming laptop without consulting me about the $1,800 expense, then acted completely surprised and defensive when I questioned why such a major purchase had been made without any discussion or planning. Patricia claimed she'd found a great deal online and didn't want to miss the opportunity, but I knew she'd been researching gaming computers for weeks and had deliberately waited until I was working a large commercial job that kept me away from home for 12-hour days. When I suggested that $1,800 was a significant expense that should have been discussed as a family decision, especially since we were supposed to be saving money for Harmony's senior year expenses and college applications, Patricia accused me of being controlling and trying to micromanage every aspect of their lives like some kind of financial dictator. Harmony had been standing right there during this conversation, and instead of acknowledging that the purchase should have been discussed with me first, she immediately sided with her mother and told me I was being unfair about something that was really important to her social life and academic success. I pointed out that she already had a perfectly functional laptop that we'd bought just 2 years earlier, but she rolled her eyes and explained that her old computer was embarrassingly slow compared to what her friends had, and that she needed better equipment to keep up with her digital art classes and online gaming with her peer group. The disrespect during family dinners became more obvious and aggressive after the laptop incident, with Harmony frequently checking her phone while I was trying to have conversations about her day or her future plans, and responding to my questions with one-word answers or sighs that made it clear she considered my interest in her life to be annoying interference. When I'd ask her to put the phone away during meals so we could talk as a family, she'd look at Patricia for permission to ignore my request, and Patricia would usually tell her it was fine to finish whatever she was doing before joining our conversation. Harmony began openly questioning why she had to follow rules I'd established when I wasn't her biological father, asking Patricia within my hearing why my opinions about curfews, chores, or academic expectations should matter when everyone knew he wasn't really her dad anyway. Patricia never corrected this attitude or supported my authority as Harmony's legal adoptive father, instead treating these challenges as normal teenage rebellion that I was taking too personally because I didn't understand the complexities of raising a modern adolescent girl. I started feeling like an outsider in my own home, watching Patricia and Harmony function as a team that made decisions together while treating me like an inconvenient third party whose input was barely tolerated and certainly not required for important choices about our family's direction and priorities. The morning after that devastating kitchen confrontation and the brutal conversation I'd overheard about being nothing more than their pipe-fixing bill payer, I called in sick to work for the first time in 3 years and began methodically executing the departure plan that had been forming in my mind since Patricia's cruel words shattered my illusions about our family dynamic. I started by contacting my real estate agent, Jennifer Walsh, who'd helped me buy the house originally, and explaining that I needed to list the property for immediate sale due to personal circumstances that required quick action and maximum return on my investment. Jennifer was surprised by the urgency but agreed to prepare listing paperwork and schedule professional photography for later that week, confident we could attract serious buyers quickly given the desirable neighborhood and extensive renovations I'd completed over the years. Next, I drove straight to Michael Rodriguez's law office and informed him that I needed to initiate divorce proceedings immediately, explaining the previous night's events and Patricia's explicit statement that I would never be Harmony's actual father despite 10 years of legal adoption, financial support, and emotional investment in raising her. Michael listened carefully to my account of the situation and assured me that the prenuptial agreement we drafted would protect my business assets and pre-marriage property, though he warned me that I'd likely lose half of any savings or improvements accumulated during the marriage itself. I spent the rest of that Tuesday systematically separating all our joint financial accounts, transferring my business funds and pre-marriage savings to a new account at a credit union across town where Patricia had no access or signature authority, while leaving enough money in our shared checking account to cover exactly 1 month of basic household expenses including the mortgage payment, utilities, and grocery budget. I calculated this amount carefully based on our average monthly spending, wanting to be fair but not generous, giving them enough time to figure out their next steps without providing ongoing financial support for people who'd made it clear they saw me as nothing more than a convenient source of funding. After securing my finances and legal position, I began the emotional task of packing my essential belongings and important documents, starting with business records, bank statements, tax returns, and legal paperwork that proved my ownership of pre-marriage assets and established my rights regarding the house and my plumbing business. I packed my tools and work equipment, my clothing and personal items, family photos that didn't include Patricia or Harmony, and sentimental objects I'd inherited from my parents, carefully avoiding anything that might be considered marital property or gifts I'd given to them over the years. I found a furnished one-bedroom apartment in a complex near my biggest commercial accounts, signing a month-to-month lease that would give me flexibility while I figured out my long-term housing situation and dealt with the divorce proceedings that would likely take several months to finalize. The apartment was basic but clean, with everything I needed to live comfortably without the emotional baggage and constant tension that had made my own home feel like enemy territory where every conversation was a potential confrontation. After loading my truck with everything I owned that wasn't connected to my marriage or stepfatherhood, I sat down at the granite kitchen counter I'd installed myself and wrote a simple note on a piece of paper torn from Harmony's school notebook, keeping my message brief and factual rather than emotional or accusatory. I wrote exactly what Patricia had told me the night before, that I was correct, I wasn't Harmony's actual father, and left it where they'd be sure to find it when they came home from their respective activities that afternoon. I locked the door behind me and drove to my new apartment, where I spent the evening setting up my temporary living situation and calling my business clients to inform them of my new address and assure them that my services would continue without interruption despite personal changes in my life. My plumbing business continued operating normally since all the contracts, equipment, vehicles, and customer relationships were in my name alone, protected by the prenuptial agreement and years of careful business management that kept personal and professional finances completely separate. I felt a strange mixture of relief and sadness as I settled into my new routine, relieved to escape the constant undermining and disrespect I'd been enduring, but sad that 10 years of what I'd thought was genuine family building had turned out to be an elaborate financial arrangement where my value was purely economic rather than emotional or relational. Patricia and Harmony discovered the harsh realities of their financial situation when my house sold within 2 weeks to cash buyers who'd been looking for exactly the kind of move-in-ready property I'd created through years of careful renovations and upgrades, forcing them to quickly search for affordable rental options in neighborhoods that were significantly less desirable than the area where they'd grown comfortable living. The sale price exceeded my original expectations by nearly $30,000. Money that went directly into my personal account since the property had been purchased and improved entirely with my pre-marriage funds, leaving Patricia with only her portion of our joint savings and whatever household items she could prove weren't part of my separate property. Within days of learning they'd have to move, Patricia began frantically calling rental agencies and discovering that landlords required proof of income, security deposits, and credit checks that revealed her limited financial resources and complete dependence on my income for the lifestyle she'd maintained during our marriage. Harmony's immediate response to our separation was a series of increasingly demanding text messages and social media posts directed at me, expressing outrage that I was cutting off financial support for her car payments, dance lessons, college savings contributions, and the general funding she'd apparently considered her permanent entitlement regardless of how she treated me. Her messages revealed a shocking sense of ownership over my money and complete inability to understand that my financial support had been connected to my role as her father, not an unconditional obligation that would continue indefinitely no matter how badly she and her mother treated me. She demanded to know how I could abandon my responsibilities to her education and future opportunities, apparently unable to grasp that calling someone not your actual father while laughing about them being merely a bill-paying handyman might have consequences for their willingness to continue funding your lifestyle indefinitely. Patricia attempted to sabotage my plumbing business by calling Henderson Property Management, my largest commercial client that provided nearly 30% of my annual revenue, with false claims about my reliability, work quality, and professional conduct, hoping to damage my reputation and income out of pure vindictive anger about losing her comfortable living situation. She told them I'd been drinking on job sites, leaving work incomplete, and overcharging for materials, apparently thinking that destroying my livelihood would somehow force me to continue supporting them or at least provide her with leverage during divorce negotiations. Fortunately, I'd maintained an excellent relationship with Henderson's maintenance director for over 6 years, completing hundreds of service calls with consistent quality and fair pricing. So when Patricia called with her accusations, they contacted me directly to ask about the situation rather than simply canceling our contract based on an angry ex-wife's obvious lies. I explained the personal circumstances behind her call and assured them that my work quality and professionalism would remain unchanged despite my marital problems, and they actually increased their service requests over the following months because they respected my honesty and reliability during a difficult personal situation. Meanwhile, Harmony's biological father unexpectedly contacted me through social media after Patricia had apparently tracked him down and convinced him to reach out, thinking that involving him in the situation might somehow pressure me to reconsider my decision to end my financial and emotional investment in their lives. David Morrison had been living in Nevada for the past 15 years, working construction jobs and apparently unaware that I'd legally adopted Harmony or that Patricia had remarried at all. And when he called me to discuss the situation, I found myself having the most honest conversation I'd had with anyone in months about what had really happened in my household. He listened carefully as I explained Patricia's pattern of undermining my parental authority while expecting continued financial support, and Harmony's increasing disrespect towards someone who'd legally adopted her and provided stability for over a decade of her life. David admitted he'd been a terrible father and husband, leaving when things got difficult instead of taking responsibility for his family, but he also confirmed my suspicions that Patricia had a long history of viewing relationships primarily through the lens of financial benefit rather than emotional connection or mutual respect. Approximately 14 months after I'd walked away from what I thought was my family, Harmony sent me a lengthy text message that arrived on a Tuesday evening while I was reviewing invoices in my new home office, and her words revealed a level of genuine self-reflection and remorse that I hadn't expected based on her previous entitled demands for continued financial support. She explained that she'd been working at a local restaurant for 8 months while attending community college part-time, living with Patricia in a cramped 2-bedroom apartment in a neighborhood where sirens woke them up several nights a week, and watching her mother cycle through the same manipulative patterns with new boyfriends that she'd used during our marriage. Harmony wrote that the reality of actually earning minimum wage while watching Patricia attempt to recreate her comfortable lifestyle through a series of increasingly desperate relationships had forced her to understand the value of what I'd provided and the genuine care I'd shown throughout her childhood and teenage years. She admitted that watching Patricia systematically manipulate her current boyfriend, a divorced electrician named Craig who was financing their rent and groceries while Patricia complained constantly about his income and lifestyle, had finally opened her eyes to the truth about how her mother had treated me during our decade together. Harmony described feeling disgusted when Patricia coached her on how to ask Craig for money for college textbooks and car repairs, using the same scripts and emotional manipulation techniques she'd witnessed but never recognized during the years when Patricia had extracted thousands of dollars from my bank account for various emergencies and necessities that somehow never seemed to reduce their financial needs. She wrote that she'd finally understood that Patricia had trained her to see me as a resource rather than a father, encouraging her disrespect and entitlement while systematically undermining any genuine relationship we might have built together if she'd been allowed to appreciate my efforts instead of learning to take them for granted. Harmony acknowledged that her behavior during the last 2 years of our relationship had been inexcusable, particularly her participation in the cruel jokes about my role in their lives and her constant challenges to my authority as someone who'd legally adopted her and invested in her future when her biological father had completely abandoned his responsibilities. She took full responsibility for treating me like an ATM instead of recognizing the sacrifice and love behind every car payment, dance lesson, tutoring session, and college fund contribution I'd made without expecting gratitude or recognition for providing opportunities she'd come to consider her automatic entitlement. Her apology included specific examples of times she'd been deliberately disrespectful, acknowledging that she'd understood perfectly well that her behavior was hurting me but had continued anyway because Patricia had convinced her that my feelings were less important than maintaining their united front against my reasonable expectations and boundaries. Harmony explained that working for her own money had taught her to appreciate the countless hours I'd spent on emergency plumbing calls at inconvenient times, weekend side jobs that funded her activities, and the constant pressure of supporting 3 people on my income while being treated like my contributions were inadequate or taken for granted. She wrote that she'd finally realized that good fathers don't abandon their children when things get difficult, and that I'd provided exactly the kind of stability, guidance, and unconditional support that she'd rejected in favor of Patricia's permissive parenting style that avoided conflict by refusing to maintain any standards or expectations. I read her message several times before responding with a brief but sincere reply, telling her that I appreciated her honesty and maturity, that I genuinely hoped she was learning valuable life lessons from her current situation, and that I wished her success in her education and future career goals. However, I also made it clear that while I forgave her and held no grudges about the past, I wouldn't be rebuilding our father-daughter relationship or resuming any form of financial support for her personal or educational expenses. I explained that some damage can't be undone, and that hearing her laugh about me being nothing more than a pipe-fixing bill payer had permanently changed how I viewed our connection and my willingness to invest emotionally in people who demonstrated such casual cruelty towards someone who devoted a decade to their well-being. Meanwhile, Patricia's subsequent relationships followed exactly the same pattern of financial dependence and emotional manipulation that had characterized our marriage, with her rapidly moving in with men who could support her lifestyle while systematically destroying their self-esteem and financial security through constant criticism and impossible demands. Her relationship with Craig lasted 8 months before he discovered she'd been using his credit cards for unauthorized purchases totaling over $4,000, including designer clothes, spa treatments, and expensive dinners with friends while telling him she was buying necessities for their household and Harmony's education. Craig pressed charges for credit card fraud after Patricia refused to take responsibility for the unauthorized spending, claiming she'd assumed he wouldn't mind covering her expenses since they were living together as a committed couple planning a future together. Patricia's arrest for financial fraud made local news because she'd attempted to use Craig's identity to open additional credit accounts when his existing cards reached their limits, apparently believing that her physical attractiveness and sob stories about raising a daughter alone would protect her from legal consequences. She eventually pleaded guilty to reduced charges and received probation with mandatory financial counseling, but the public record of her conviction destroyed any remaining credibility she might have had with future romantic targets who performed basic background checks before entering serious relationships. I learned about these developments through mutual friends and neighbors who'd kept in touch, but I felt only distant sympathy for people who'd created their own problems through consistent poor choices and exploitation of others' generosity. I'd established a comfortable and peaceful life as a single man, growing my business by 20% over the past year through referrals from satisfied customers who appreciated reliable service and fair pricing, and I'd started dating a divorced nurse named Jennifer who had 2 teenage sons and understood the complexities of blended families. Jennifer appreciated my steady income and responsible lifestyle without expecting me to fund elaborate luxuries or tolerate disrespectful behavior from her children, and our relationship developed naturally without the constant financial pressure and emotional manipulation that had characterized my marriage to Patricia. I'd learned to recognize genuine appreciation versus exploitation in relationships, understanding that real love supports your goals and respects your boundaries instead of constantly testing your willingness to sacrifice your well-being for someone else's comfort and convenience.